The first laugh came before the cabin even had a door. It was a short, sharp sound carried on the dry wind, the kind of laugh that didn't bother explaining itself. A man leaning on a fence rail let it out when he saw the roof go on, low, sloped, tight, with no black pipe stabbing up through the boards. He squinted, tilted his head and laughed again, louder this time so others would turn and see what he saw. No chimney, not even a hole marked for one. By sundown, everyone on that stretch of valley knew. By the next morning, the story had already grown teeth. "She forgot it," someone said at the feed store. "No," another answered, shaking his head. "She thinks she doesn't need one." That was when the laughing really started. The widow heard it from where she stood, ankle deep in frozen mud, her skirts tied up with twine so they wouldn't drag. She was fitting the last wall plank into place, driving it home with measured blows, each strike controlled, deliberate. Her hands were cracked, swollen at the knuckles, red raw where the cold had split the skin. She did not stop working when the voices drifted down the slope. She had learned early what laughter cost when you answered it. The cabin was small, smaller than most, built tight against the cut of the hillside, half sheltered by earth and stone. The logs were trimmed close, fitted carefully, chinked thick. The roof sat low enough that a tall man would have to duck inside, and there was no chimney, no iron pipe, no stone stack rising from the roofline. To the men watching from the road, that absence was everything. Winter was already pressing down from the north. You could feel it in the mornings, in the way the air bit deeper each day, in how the creek skinned over with ice before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. This valley knew winter. It buried animals where they stood. It froze men in their sleep when storms came wrong. Everyone here knew what a cabin needed. A stove, a chimney, smoke rising like proof of life. Without it, you were already dead, just not yet laid down. The widow's name was spoken less often than her mistake. Some still remembered it. Most didn't bother. She had arrived 2 summers back with a coffin wagon and 2 children clinging to her skirts, eyes too old for their faces. Her husband had been buried on the ridge before the first frost that year. No sermon, no marker, just earth and stone, and a silence that followed her down into the valley. She had taken work when it was offered, washing, mending, cooking during hay season. She did not ask for credit. She did not complain when the pay was light. And when the talk turned to land claims, she chose a strip no one else wanted. Too close to the slope, too shaded, too rocky. "Won't grow straight timber," someone had said. She had nodded. "I won't be growing timber." Now she was building without a chimney. The first man to speak to her about it did so kindly, as if kindness would soften the truth. "You'll want to cut a hole before the snow comes," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the roof. "Once it starts, you won't get another chance." She set her hammer down, slow, looked at the roof, looked back at him. "I won't be cutting one." He frowned, thinking he'd misheard. "You'll smoke yourself out." "I won't," she said. He waited for more. When none came, he shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "There's no other way to heat a place." She wiped her hands on her apron, left pale streaks of dried clay across the fabric. "There are other ways." He laughed then, though not cruelly. "Not here." She picked her hammer back up. Conversation over. The rumors changed after that. What had started as concern turned sharp. "She thinks she's smarter than the cold. She's gone strange since the man died." Those poor kids. The children were part of every sentence now. They were quiet ones. The boy, older, helped where he could, hauling kindling, carrying water in a tin pail that banged against his knees. The girl stayed closer to her mother, hands tucked into sleeves too long for her arms, eyes following every movement with careful attention. Neither laughed. Neither wandered far. People watched them when they thought the widow wasn't looking, watched their cheeks redden in the wind, watched the way they pressed close together when the sun dipped early behind the ridge. "She's killing them," someone said one night, certain enough to repeat it. The widow did not answer any of it. Inside the cabin, the floor was packed, earth mixed with clay, smoothed hard. The walls were sealed tight, the door fit close. There were no gaps left to sing when the wind came. And near the center of the floor, slightly raised, shaped with care, sat a broad, low stone platform, its surface darkened already, as if it remembered heat. She fed it in the evenings, not with flame that roared and leapt, but with a slow fire that burned low, covered, smothered until it glowed beneath its own skin. When the coals were right, she sealed them in, closed the iron plate she had traded 3 weeks washing for, and waited. By morning, the stone still breathed warmth. No smoke rose from the roof. That was what the valley saw. What they did not see was the way the cabin held the night, the way the earth pressed close along the back wall, steady and cold and patient, the way the heat stayed low where children slept, the way there was nothing to draw it upward and away. Still, when the first real storm of the season rolled in, people shook their heads and said it was only a matter of time. It came hard and early, snow that fell sideways, driven by a fire wind that scoured skin raw. Fences vanished by noon. Paths filled in behind your steps. The sky flattened into a white ceiling that pressed down on the land. Smoke columns dotted the valley like signals. Proof of fire. Proof of survival. One cabin, tight against the hillside, showed nothing at all. That night, the temperature dropped fast, faster than anyone expected. Wood cracked in the cold. Nails screamed in boards as they shrank. The creek locked solid. The widow barred her door and fed the stone one last time. The children lay down, wrapped together, their breath soft and even. She did not sleep much. She listened to the wind test the walls, listened to the roof hold, listened to the silence where a chimney draft would have been. By morning, the storm had not eased. By the second night, men began to worry, not for her, but for themselves. Snow climbed past windowsills, drifts packed against doors, smoke thinned as wood burned faster in the cold. Someone said it out loud, the thing they had all been circling. If hers holds without a chimney? No one finished the thought. The deadliest blizzard the valley had seen in a generation was just beginning to close its fist, and the one cabin everyone had mocked showed no sign of surrender. The third morning arrived without a sunrise. There was only a dim, bruised light behind the cloud cover, like the world was being seen through dirty wool. Snow had piled so high against the windows of the lower cabins that some folks woke to darkness, blinking like they'd been buried alive. Doors wouldn't open. Shutters were jammed. The wind had packed the drifts into something close to ice. Men who'd lived here their whole lives stepped outside, took one look at the sky and felt something cold and unfamiliar slip into their stomachs. Something beyond weather. This wasn't a hard winter day. This was a storm with an intention. In the middle of the valley, smoke that usually rose steady from chimneys now came in thin, weak threads. Some stacks showed nothing at all, not because the fires were out, but because the wind tore the smoke sideways and hammered it back down onto roofs, shoving it into cracks and under eaves. People coughed when they opened their doors. Some cabins stank of soot, others stank of fear. At the McRae place, the stove drew badly, and by noon the family was arguing in sharp, panicked whispers. "You've got to clear the chimney cap," Mr. McRae snapped, eyes watering from smoke that refused to rise. "I'm not climbing that roof in this," his eldest shot back. "You want the baby breathing that?" McRae's wife cried, pulling the blanket tighter around the infant, whose little face was already flushed. Then, over the sound of wind clawing at boards, another sound, a deep, groaning crack. The stovepipe shifted. The joint at the wall separated just enough, and a ribbon of smoke curled right into the room. That was the moment McRae's wife started to sob. Across the valley, it was the same story, wearing different faces. Chimneys that drew fine in calm air turned into enemies when the wind shifted. Snow plugged caps, ice narrowed flues, drafts reversed. People had always trusted the chimney. It was the throat of the house. Now it felt like a hand over the mouth. Out at the edge of the settlement, where the hillside rose rough and dark, the widow's cabin sat half buried in white. Snow had drifted up the back wall and over the roofline in soft, dangerous curves. From a distance, it looked less like a cabin and more like a mound, just another part of the slope. Still, no smoke. It bothered men in a way they didn't admit out loud, because smoke was proof, and the lack of it was a question. By the afternoon of the third day, the first neighbor tried to go to her. His name was Orrin Lyle, a widower himself, older, with hands like knots. He had been among the first to laugh, quietly to himself, when he'd heard she was building without a chimney. Not because he hated her, because the idea sounded like a child's daydream. Now he strapped a scarf over his face, took a shovel, and stepped into the storm. He got 40 yards before he understood what he'd done. The wind hit him like a wall. Snow swirled so thick he couldn't see the fence post he'd just passed. The cold was the kind that didn't just sting, it stole. It reached into your breath and took it away. His eyebrows iced, his eyelashes clumped, his lungs burned as he tried to draw air through the scarf. He turned back after 10 minutes, and the hardest part was finding his own door. When he finally slammed inside, shoulders heaving, his wife's old shawl still hanging on a peg by habit, he leaned against the wall and stared at the stove like it was a thing that might betray him. "She's up there," he rasped. His daughter looked up, cheeks gray. "Who?" "The widow. She's up there in that hole of hers." "Did you see her?" the girl asked. He shook his head. Couldn't see anything, but the thought planted itself, spread. By evening, men began talking in the brief moments they dared open doors. They leaned into wind-sheltered corners. Ah shouted over the howl, "She'll be dead by now." "Maybe she already is. Those kids, though." Always the children. The children became a weight on the tongue, a reason to worry without sounding foolish. That night, a problem turned into a crisis. At the Eddins cabin, 2 miles down near the creek, smoke filled the room so thick that Mrs. Eddins collapsed while trying to carry water. Her husband dragged her to the door, shoved it open, and the wind screamed in like an animal. Snow blasted across the floor. Their two boys cried. The baby wailed until its voice turned hoarse. Mr. Eddins made a choice that would have sounded insane a week earlier. He grabbed a rope, looped it around his waist, tied the other end to the bedpost, and crawled out to the chimney in the dark, using his hands like a blind man. He came back with blood on his knuckles and ice in his beard, breathing like he'd swallowed fire. He had cleared the cap with the handle of his hatchet, but his hands shook so badly he could barely hold the axe anymore. "Not again," he croaked. "I can't do that again." His wife lay on the floor, half-conscious, lips pale, eyes fluttering, and in the corner, the oldest boy stared at his father with something like a question he was afraid to ask. What happens when the chimney fails? That question, unspoken, hung heavy in cabin after cabin across the valley. Meanwhile, in the widow's home, there was no chimney to fail, but that didn't mean everything was safe. Inside, the air was still, warm at floor level, cooler higher up. The kind of warmth that didn't slap your face but settled into your bones slowly, like it had always belonged there. The boy, Caleb, sat cross-legged near the stone platform, hands held out over it. The girl, Mara, leaned against her mother's side, drowsy but fighting sleep, her hair braided tight to keep it from tangling. Their mother, Elsbeth, moved quietly, conserving strength. She checked the seams along the door, pressed her palm to the wall chinking. She had packed it thick with clay and hair and straw, like she'd learned from an older woman who'd once lived farther north. She listened for whistles, for any thin song of air. The storm had a way of finding even the smallest mistake. At dusk, she did something that looked like foolishness if you didn't understand. She took a pan of coals, carefully, slowly, and slid it into a shallow pit under the stone platform, then covered it. She did not let flame rise. She did not feed it oxygen. So she smothered it until it became a steady, low heat source that would last. Mara watched with heavy eyes. "Will it last all night?" Elsbeth didn't answer immediately. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. "It has to." Caleb shifted. "If it doesn't?" Elsbeth looked at him, really looked, at his thin wrists, his chapped lips, the way he was trying to stand taller than his fear. "Then we'll do the next thing," she said. "And the next?" he pressed, because children always need to know where the line ends. Elsbeth paused long enough that Mara's small hand tightened on her sleeve. "There is always a next thing," Elsbeth said, but her eyes had a shadow in them that wasn't from the dim light. Because the truth was, she had built the cabin for cold. She hadn't built it for what was coming. The wind outside had changed. It no longer screamed in one direction. It swirled, it searched, it clawed down the slope and hammered the roof from different angles, as if testing for weakness. Snow pressed against the door so hard it bowed the wood slightly inward. When Elsbeth set her shoulder to it from inside, she felt the weight of it. Tons, not inches. If they needed to leave, they wouldn't. Elsbeth understood that with a kind of calm that felt like stepping into ice water. She didn't panic. Panic wasted breath, wasted warmth, wasted time. She gathered extra blankets, pulled them down from the wall pegs, laid them around the children like a nest. She had stitched those blankets herself from old sacks and worn quilts bought for pennies. Ugly blankets, heavy ones, good ones. She brought the children closer to the stone platform. Not on it, never on it, but near enough that warmth slid into their feet and calves. She made them drink water even when they didn't want to, because dehydration made you colder. She made them eat, even when their stomachs tightened from worry. She did not tell them what she was thinking. She did not tell them that the storm sounded different now. Not just wind, something heavier, wood groaning, trees snapping, the ridge shedding snow like an avalanche in slow motion. Near midnight, Mara woke with a sharp inhale. "Mama," she whispered. Elsbeth was already awake. "I'm here." "I heard," Mara swallowed. It sounded like something fell. Elsbeth listened. For a moment there was only the steady roar. Then, faint but real, a deep thump somewhere outside, followed by a scrape. Caleb sat up, eyes wide. Elsbeth got to her feet. She moved to the back wall, the one pressed into the hillside, put her palm against it. She felt it, a tremor, small, like the earth had shifted its shoulder. The ridge above them had taken too much snow. The weight had become too heavy. The storm was piling and piling and piling, and gravity didn't care about men's cabins. If the slope gave way, Elsbeth backed away slowly, as if sudden movement might invite disaster. She looked at the children. Their faces were pale in the lamplight. "Stay close," she said. Caleb's voice cracked. "Is it gonna—" Elsbeth cut him off gently but firmly. "Stay close." She went to the corner where she kept her tools. She pulled free the hatchet, not for chopping wood. There was no time for other things. Then she went to the ceiling. There was a small vent, no wider than her palm, near the roofline. Not a chimney, not a draft, just a controlled opening she could seal or open. She had built it for days when the cabin needed air, for cooking, for sickness, for life. Now she pressed her fingers along the edge of it. It was iced. The storm had coated it from outside. If the coals under the platform ever smoked, they would have nowhere to go. She didn't let her hand shake. She took the hatchet and carefully chipped at the vent's edge, just enough to break the ice seal, then closed it again tight. Controlled. Everything had to stay controlled. Because outside, the valley was losing control. On the fourth day, a man died, not from the cold alone, from a chain of things that began with a chimney. His name was Russell Haynes. He had a good cabin, built stout, with a stone chimney that had stood for years. He had a wife, no children. He had been proud of that chimney, called it the spine of the house. That morning, his wife found him slumped by the stove, lips blue, eyes half open. The stovepipe had backed smoke into the room during the night. Not enough to choke loudly, just enough to steal oxygen slowly. He had likely woken, coughed, tried to fix it, then sat down, just for a moment, and never stood again. When word spread, it did so like a sickness. People who had laughed at the widow's cabin stopped laughing. They stopped talking at all for a while. And then, in the hush that followed, the thought that had been simmering boiled over into action. If a man with a chimney could die, what about a woman without one? Oren Lyle tried again that afternoon, this time with two younger men. They tied a rope between them, like sailors in a storm. They wrapped their faces, carried shovels, and a pry bar. They made it farther this time, crawling more than walking, using fence posts and buried rocks like landmarks. But halfway up the slope, the wind turned meaner. The rope jerked. One man stumbled. Snow filled his mouth. He started to gag, and in that gagging breath, he inhaled cold air so sharp it made him cough hard. That cough nearly killed him. Because he couldn't stop, he doubled over, hacking, while the wind drove snow down his throat. Oren grabbed him, tried to haul him upright, but his hands slipped on ice-slick wool. They turned back. They had to. When they stumbled into the nearest cabin for shelter, panting, their faces frosted white, someone asked the question everyone was thinking. What if she's already gone? Oren's eyes were wild. Oh, then we'll have to dig her out when this ends. And the children? Someone whispered. Oren's jaw flexed. God help us. That night the storm's voice changed again. A low, constant moan joined the wind, like the valley itself was complaining. Snow didn't fall in flakes anymore. It came like sand, stinging, endless. Elsbeth sat with her children pressed close, and she realized with a sudden clarity that made her stomach clench. They weren't waiting out a storm. They were trapped inside a sealed world, with only the heat they could ration and the air they could protect. Mara had started to cough, a dry, small cough, more from cold air than smoke. Caleb rubbed her back, his face tight. Elsbeth watched their lips, their fingers, the color in their cheeks. Sleep, she told them. Caleb shook his head. I can't. You can, she said. Your body needs it. He stared at her. Do you think we'll die? It was the kind of question children ask when they've heard too many adult whispers. Elsbeth could have lied. Instead, she leaned closer until her forehead almost touched his. I think, she said carefully, that we're going to do everything right, and that matters. Caleb swallowed. But does it? Elsbeth pressed her hand over his, warm, steady. It matters, she repeated. Now close your eyes. Caleb closed them, but his lashes trembled. Mara finally drifted, her breath soft against the blanket. Elsbeth sat awake, listening, because somewhere in the darkness outside, wood cracked again. A tree snapped, with a sound like a gunshot. Snow slid. Something heavy shifted on the ridge. And then, faint, unmistakable, she heard a shout, not inside her cabin, outside. A human voice, torn up by wind, distant but real. Elsbeth's blood went cold. No one could be out there. No one sane. The shout came again, closer this time, then cut off abruptly, like a mouth had been filled with snow. Elsbeth rose, silent, stepped to the door, put her ear to the wood. She heard nothing for a long moment. Then, 3 dull impacts against the door. Not knocks, more like someone throwing their weight against it. Elsbeth's hand went to the latch. Caleb's eyes flew open. Mama! Stay, she hissed, low. Another impact, and then a voice, ragged, panicked, nearly gone. Help! Elsbeth froze, because the storm wasn't just trying to kill them anymore. It had brought someone to her door, someone who had dared the whiteout and reached the only chimney-less cabin on the hill. Because maybe in the middle of the deadliest blizzard, that cabin was the only one that didn't betray you. Elsbeth gripped the latch. If she opened the door, she'd let in the storm. If she didn't, that voice outside would stop, and her children would hear it. Elsbeth did not open the door, not right away. That decision, those few heartbeats of stillness, would haunt her later, no matter how this ended. She stood with her hand on the latch, feeling the vibration of the wind through the wood, listening to the storm scream as if it were alive and furious at being denied entry. Another thud struck the door, weaker than the last. Then a scraping sound, as if someone were sliding downward. "Mama!" Caleb whispered again, panic cutting through his attempt at bravery. "Someone's out there." "I know," Elsbeth said, her voice barely more than breath. She forced herself to think, to count, to slow her heart. If she opened the door fully, even for seconds, the heat they had guarded for days would spill out like blood from a wound. Snow would rush in, fine and dry and merciless. The children's nest would be exposed. The stone platform would cool faster than she could bring it back. But if she did nothing, Elsbeth slid the latch just enough to peer through the narrow gap she had built for this exact reason. A hand width, no more. The wind immediately fought her, shoving snow through the crack. She braced her shoulder, muscles screaming. Outside, a shape lay slumped against the doorframe. A man, wrapped poorly, face crusted white, beard stiff with ice. His eyes were open but unfocused, blinking slow, like he was already halfway somewhere else. He tried to speak again. Nothing came out. Hypothermia. Elsbeth had seen it before. She snapped the door shut. Caleb gasped. "Mama! I know," she said sharply, then softened. "I know." She turned, grabbed the coil of rope from the wall, and looped it around her waist with hands that did not shake. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear didn't help now. "Mara," she whispered, crouching by her daughter. "Stay under the blankets. Don't move, no matter what you hear." Mara's eyes were wide, glassy. She nodded. Elsbeth took a breath, counted to 3, then yanked the door open hard, just long enough. The wind slammed into her like a living thing. Snow blasted her face, filled her mouth, her nose, her eyes. She dropped to one knee, hooked her arm under the man's shoulders, and hauled. He was heavier than he looked, dead weight already creeping in. The rope went taut as she leaned back, dragging him inch by inch across the threshold. Snow poured in around them. The heat fled in a rush so sudden it made her gasp. She slammed the door shut with her heel. Silence fell like a held breath. The man lay on her floor, chest barely moving, lips pale, fingers curled like claws. Caleb scrambled forward. "Is he alive?" Elsbeth said. "Barely." She moved fast now. No wasted motion. She cut away his outer coat with the hatchet, peeled off frozen layers, ignoring the sting as cold soaked into her hands. She dragged him closer to the stone platform, not onto it, never onto it, and laid him on the warmest stretch of floor. She did not rub his limbs. She did not try to make him stand. She knew better. Instead, she covered him. Heavy blankets, layered, tucked tight. She pressed her ear to his chest, a heartbeat, slow, stubborn. She exhaled. "Caleb," she said. "Get the cup, the small one." Caleb moved instantly. The man coughed then, a weak rattling sound that turned into a wet gasp. His eyes rolled, focused briefly on the low ceiling, the walls, the children watching him like frightened animals. "No, Chim," he croaked, voice shredded. Elsbeth leaned close. "You're safe. Don't try to talk." He blinked at her, confusion clouding his face. "Smoke? No smoke," she said. "Breathe slow." His brow furrowed. He tried to lift his hand and failed. "Who?" he whispered. "Doesn't matter," she said. "You're alive." She pressed the cup to his lips, let him sip warm water a drop at a time. Too much would shock him, too fast could kill him. The cabin smelled faintly of damp wool and cold iron. No smoke, no soot, no sharp bite in the air. The man's breathing steadied, though it remained shallow. Caleb crouched beside him, eyes flicking to his mother. "Who is he?" Elsbeth glanced at the man's face, now thawing enough to show features beneath the ice. "I think," she said quietly, "he's Thomas Eddins's brother." Caleb's eyes widened. "From down near the creek?" Elsbeth nodded. She had seen him once or twice. Loud voice, big laugh, strong arms. The kind of man who trusted his strength to carry him through weather. Not tonight. "He tried to come for us," Caleb said slowly, realization dawning. Elsbeth didn't answer, because if that was true, if someone had risked the storm to reach her, then others might try, and the thought terrified her more than the wind ever had. By morning, or what passed for morning, the man was alive. Still weak, still drifting, but alive. His name was Jonah Eddins. He whispered it when Elsbeth asked, like saying it out loud, anchored him to it. He had left his brother's cabin after smoke filled the room again. His sister-in-law had fainted. The baby's breathing had turned strange. Jonah had volunteered to run to the widow's place because someone had said she had no chimney, and therefore no smoke. It sounded insane. It sounded like hope. "I didn't think," Jonah whispered, eyes flicking to the sealed roof, the low walls. "Didn't think it'd be warm." Elsbeth met his gaze. "It is," Jonah swallowed. "You saved me." Elsbeth didn't respond to that either, because outside, the storm had not finished its work. By midday, word spread. Despite the storm, despite the isolation. A man had gone to the widow's cabin. A man had returned. Jonah was dragged back on a sled made of doors and fence rails by men who followed his tracks before the wind erased them. When he reached his brother's cabin, his first hoarse words were not about fear or cold. "It's warm," he rasped. "No smoke, no draft. The kids were asleep." That sentence moved through the valley faster than the wind. No smoke, no draft. Warm. By nightfall, desperation cracked something open. At the McRae place, the baby stopped crying. Just stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming had been. Mrs. McRae clutched the child to her chest, shaking. "It's too quiet," she whispered. Mr. McRae stared at the stove, then at the chimney that had nearly killed them twice already. He made a decision he would have sworn impossible a week earlier. They left the stove cold. They bundled the baby, wrapped the children, took only what they could carry. They aimed for the hillside. Others did the same. Not all. Some stayed put. Some couldn't move. Some trusted their chimneys to the end. But by the third night after Jonah's return, figures began appearing through the white. Small groups, pairs, families tied together with rope, crawling, stumbling, praying. Elsbeth heard them before she saw them. A distant shout, a shape collapsing near the drifted wall. Then another. Her heart pounded. Her cabin had not been built for this. She opened the door only when she had to, only when someone reached the threshold. She let in cold, she let in snow, she let in people. The heat bled away faster now. The stone platform worked harder, gave up its warmth more quickly. She rationed blankets. She moved children closer to the floor. She sealed the door again and again. The cabin filled with breath and fear and whispered prayers. Someone cried quietly in the corner. Someone else whispered, "She was right," like a confession. Elsbeth did not correct them. She was too busy keeping people alive. At some point in the long, endless night, a sound cut through the murmurs. A deep, thunderous crack. The ridge above them shifted. Snow moved, not in drifts now, but in a single, heavy mass. Elsbeth felt it through the floor before she heard it. The earth pressed. The back wall groaned. Someone screamed. "Stay down!" Elsbeth shouted, voice cutting through panic. The snow slid, not fast, but unstoppable, piling against the back of the cabin. Pressure built. Wood bowed. Caleb clutched Mara, eyes huge. "Mama!" The wall held, barely. When the movement stopped, the cabin leaned, but did not break. The hillside had swallowed them deeper, sealing them in earth and snow. The storm raged on. They were alive, but now they were trapped. No one could leave. No one could come. The warmth they had guarded was now all they had. Elsbeth leaned against the wall, exhausted, listening to the breathing of too many people in too small a space, and realized the cruel truth. The chimney-less cabin that had saved them from smoke and wind had now become a sealed refuge, with a limit, and the storm outside had no intention of ending soon. The cabin did not collapse. That was the first mercy. The second was quieter, harder to recognize at first. The snow that sealed them in also silenced the wind. When the ridge finished settling, when the last groan of timber faded into stillness, the roar outside dulled into a distant pressure, like the storm had wrapped them in a thick hand instead of striking directly. The sound changed, less screaming, more weight. Elsbeth stood very still, one palm pressed flat against the back wall, feeling for cracks, for seepage, for the sudden cold that would mean failure. Nothing. The wall bowed, yes, but it held. For a long moment no one spoke. Grown men crouched low like children. Women clutched infants to their chests, counting breaths. Someone whispered a prayer and forgot the words halfway through. Then Mara spoke. Her voice was small, but it carried. "Is it over?" Elsbeth closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "No," she said honestly, "but it's different now." That mattered, because storms that screamed could be fought. Storms that pressed and waited demanded something else entirely. Time, air, care. The cabin was crowded beyond anything Elsbeth had planned for. She had built it for 3 bodies, not 13. Every movement had to be measured now. Every breath mattered. She moved among them quietly, the way she had moved among her children for years, touching shoulders, checking color in cheeks, counting breaths without anyone noticing. She took stock without panic. No one was coughing smoke. No one's lips were blue. The air was still clean. That alone felt like a miracle. Jonah Eddins stirred, propped up against the wall. His face was gray but improving. When he saw how many people had gathered, his eyes widened. "Good Lord," he whispered. "You took them all in." Elsbeth shook her head. "I took in the ones who made it." Jonah swallowed. "The rest?" Elsbeth didn't answer. They both knew what the storm did to those who stayed too long with bad air, with failing chimneys, with doors that froze shut from the outside. Jonah wiped his face with shaking hands. "My brother, my wife, they're here?" Elsbeth asked. He nodded, eyes shining. "They came last night. You were asleep." Elsbeth allowed herself a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The baby, still wrapped tight, still breathing, lay nestled between its parents near the stone platform, where the heat pooled low and steady. The child's skin was warm to the touch, not flushed, not cold, alive. Someone noticed. Someone whispered it. "That baby's warm." A dangerous thing, Hope. Elsbeth stamped it down gently. "Stay close to the floor," she told them all. "Heat rises. Don't waste it." They listened. They had learned to listen. The hours blurred. Daylight never truly came, but the dark shifted slightly, enough to mark time if you were watching closely. Elsbeth opened the vent for moments at a time, seconds, not minutes, counting in her head, then sealing it again. Fresh air in, warmth preserved. She fed the stone platform carefully, sparingly. The coals under it glowed dull red, sealed and patient. Not enough to choke, not enough to burn fast, just enough. People slept in turns. When someone stirred too hard, Elsbeth was there, pressing them back down, whispering instructions. She rationed water. She rationed movement. She rationed fear, most of all. Late in what might have been the second night sealed in, the crying started. Not a baby, a man. He sat hunched near the door, face buried in his hands, shoulders shaking silently at first, and then harder. His wife tried to shush him, panicked by the noise, but Elsbeth shook her head. "Let him," she said quietly. "It's worse if it stays inside." The man sobbed into his palms, grief pouring out in broken gasps. He had left his brother behind, had heard the chimney crack, had smelled smoke and known what it meant. No one told him it would be all right. No one lied. They simply let him cry until the sound ran out of him. When the cabin finally grew quiet again, Elsbeth realized something that chilled her more than the cold ever had. They were no longer waiting for rescue. They were surviving on their own terms now. Outside, the storm loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, not with a clean ending, but with a gradual retreat, like a predator backing away when it realized the fight would cost too much. Snow stopped falling first. Then the pressure eased. The cabin creaked as the weight shifted again, not dangerously this time, but enough to make everyone tense. Elsbeth waited, always waited. When she finally cracked the door open wider than a hand's breadth, light spilled in, not bright, but real. A grey, exhausted daylight that made everyone blink. Cold rushed in, but it was a different cold, cleaner, honest. The storm had moved on. They did not rush out. Elsbeth wouldn't let them. Avalanches came after storms. Roofs collapsed under delayed weight. The valley was treacherous now, reshaped. It was hours before the first man crawled out, shovel in hand, blinking like he'd been underground too long. What he saw stole the breath from his chest. Cabins half buried, chimneys snapped clean off at the roofline. Smoke-blackened snow near doors where people had tried to vent poison out of their homes. One place, Russell Haynes's, stood silent, door half open, snow blown deep inside. The valley looked wounded. When the others emerged, one by one, word spread quickly. People came staggering from drifts, from shelters that had barely held. Some carried bodies, some carried nothing at all, and all of them looked at the widow's cabin the same way. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't large, but it was standing, and everyone who had entered it had walked back out. Men gathered near the slope later that day, speaking low. No laughter now, no jokes. One of them, Orrin Lyle, cleared his throat. "We were wrong." No one argued. Another man looked up at the roof. "No chimney," he said, like he was still testing the words. Elsbeth stood in the doorway, Mara at her side. Caleb leaning against her hip. She looked smaller than ever in the open air, like the wind might carry her off if it tried. "It's not magic," she said when the silence stretched too long. "It's just heat kept where it belongs." Orrin nodded slowly. "You knew." Elsbeth shook her head. "I hoped." They stood there a while, staring at chimneys that had betrayed them, at smoke stains that marked near misses and losses. No one mocked anything. In the days that followed, the valley counted its dead. Fewer than it could have been, more than anyone wanted. And every story bent back sooner or later to the same point on the hillside, to the small cabin pressed into earth, to the children who had slept through the worst nights while others choked and froze. Men came with questions, with apologies they didn't know how to phrase, with offers of help that sounded clumsy in their mouths. Elsbeth accepted wood, accepted labor, accepted silence. She did not accept praise because she knew what had really saved them, not the lack of a chimney, but the refusal to let heat and hope escape just because everyone else said it had to. When winter loosened fully and spring finally bled into the valley, new chimneys went up, and some didn't. Low stone platforms appeared in cabins that had never known them before. Vents were cut small and careful. Doors were sealed tighter. Floors were packed thicker. Children slept closer to the ground. And whenever a new family arrived, shivering and unsure, someone always pointed up the slope and said, "See that cabin? The one without the chimney. That's how you survive a storm that doesn't care what you believe."